I don't get that. Like, can you explain the reasoning behind that? Because this is my 2 cents, 3 from whatever. But I always thought of people essentially know what they want. They essentially know what will work for them. My method may not be like your method, but your method is working for you, and I have no right to take that away from you. In the same way as you have no right to impose yours on me. So you stick to yours and I stick to mine, and we'll both progress and we'll be happy. So can you explain why we should try and convert? Because that's what it sounded like to me.
Those people in the audience who know me will be struck at how polite this response is going to be. It doesn't matter what works for me and what works for you, because that has no bearing on whether we're right or wrong. Okay? So if I were to think that it works for me to keep slaves in my garage, we would have a problem. Okay? So let's just clean that debris right out the way at the start. That what works for me is relevant to what should I do and what should you do. Secondly, I didn't argue that you should go around converting people. I explicitly said that our most rational strategy might be to let religion die out, because it's going to anyway, and that we should rather focus on things like poverty. So I didn't actually make that strong claim. But if you do think that it's worthwhile going around spending time trying to deconvert people, get rid of religion, then there are good reasons to try to do that. A, because they waste our money, just on a very pragmatic level, tax exemptions and that sort of thing. They inform policy. So our traditional court sport, that some of you might know about. It entrenches sexism. It allows for husbands to abuse their wives. It doesn't allow women to get representation in courts. And that sort of a bill comes from a worldview which doesn't value evidence, which values superstition and dogma and tradition. Okay, so superstition and dogma and tradition harm people, causes people to pray over their child instead of driving them to hospital and allowing the child to die. Okay, so these are reasons why we can legitimately persuade people that religion is better.
I just also respond to your question, that I think from my perspective, if I'm trying to persuade somebody to be an atheist, it's often not an attack but a defense. Because religious people spend quite a lot of time trying to persuade me to see things their way. It's a reaction to that when I try and persuade them to see things my way instead.
There's some here.
So something else to add on that point about attack and defense. I admired a lot of what you said being about looking beyond being right and being wrong, and not wanting so much to draw a line in the sand and saying I'm right, as opposed to essentially what I sort of cultivating listening skills or debating skills to actually get some kind of dialogue. So I wonder whether it might be useful to, when you do experience someone's approach as an attack on your beliefs, whether you could look at it and say, what is it that's being attacked? Is it me? And can I, in a sense, surrender this belief for a moment and say, well, perhaps I'm wrong, and still be happy? Because that would relieve you of a great deal of defensiveness, or the need to defend against an obnoxious theist.
I agree, and we do spend too much time, I think, investing our own self-worth in propositional content of our beliefs. Instead of just understanding ourselves as these modular creatures with various beliefs, where some of them can be discarded and some reinforced, none of which actually affect your self-worth. Obviously there's some core things which you do think of as defining your self-identity and self-worth, but in general, no. So yeah, we need to be able to tinker with the consequences of changing our minds.
A point on strategy, because you basically spoke mostly about strategy and how to achieve the kinds of goals that atheism and the society basically is looking towards achieving. And I found that you tended to use a little bit of terminology such as combating religion and they're wrong and the opposition, that sort of thing, which creates a very much of, at least in my experience of this lecture, very much of an us and them experience, which is like a war and religion kind of thing, which in terms of strategy, I find as a little bit of a dangerous approach, because I think that as members of this society, we're maybe not, especially in terms of what you spoke about in this lecture, we're not looking to change beliefs, but we're looking to affect human, affect change in society for the sake of human benefit. So I guess my point is, in terms of strategy, it might be useful to look at whether we're combating belief or whether we're combating belief where it creates problems like dehumanization and injustice and social things. Because there have been situations where certain theistic beliefs have benefited into, like, missionaries have gone around in certain areas helping with creating hospitals and education and sort of things. I mean, I don't know too much about the details there, but I do know that there have been situations where religious institutions have benefited society in a way that we would like to see it benefit. So I think in terms of the opposition of us against them, maybe we should be looking at a little bit more of a viewpoint of the them that we're specifically looking at, as whether they are theists or whether they are theists that produce.
Of a certain sort.
Yeah.
No, I see what you're saying. I think that there's a little bit of a red herring. I mean, I think it's difficult to speak about oppositional ideas without that sort of language. And I think in the context of the things I was saying, it's quite clear that I wasn't trying to be antagonistic about it. But I do see your point that I just don't think there is any other language available to us.
Okay.
But on your substantive point, I certainly agree that we shouldn't needlessly rail against the sorts, we shouldn't rail as strongly against the sorts of faith-based activities that cause harms, that don't cause harms as the ones that do. But at the same time, I wouldn't quite agree, because all of the not obviously harmful faith-based things could be done from other motivations too. So at the same time, try to encourage those alternative motivations as a way to eliminate the faith-based ones entirely in the long run. But certainly not aggressively. No, there's no reason for that, because there's no harm being caused. Apart from this background harm I spoke about earlier on, of believing false things. So that's a bad thing in principle, right, to believe false things.
Just to add to your response, you also, I think Dawkins actually talks a lot about how many harmful beliefs provide a supporting structure, many unharmful beliefs provide a supporting structure for harmful beliefs. So because we allow, because we tolerate beliefs that are not offensive, that are not difficult to sort of deal with, we open the door for stronger beliefs that are built from the same principles or from the same text or come from the same place. And we tend to sort of, society as a whole tends to give them special
privileges. Yeah. Respect. I mean, that's right. It does same house and the faith, and that's certainly true. And you can extend that. It's a very valuable lesson. You can extend that to things like racism and sexism as well. And I'm sure some of you have encountered allegedly liberal-minded friends who tell racist and sexist jokes amongst themselves because they think, we all know that we're cool about this. But as I keep saying to people like that, that doesn't cater for the person who passes by and hears you telling a racist joke and thinks, oh, well, this is how we talk. Again, get some sort of validation from that point of view or that way of speaking in a sense. There's got to be a consistent social message that certain sorts of things are wrong and other ones are right. So you provide this kind of background encouragement sometimes.
I've been thinking for a while what to say exactly, but I think perhaps of it is, what do you believe the intelligent design agenda is? Because it seems that they're quite prepared to use a number of falsehoods, like irreducible complexity, which are knocked down on forums and things, but they rear their very ugly head many times, and they'll use that to prove that there's a God. But what is their ultimate agenda? Because is it simply to say, look people, there's a God. What's the agenda?
I mean, you've got to remember that we talk about the Vatican as a clear example of a business, right? As a clear example of a religious business. But that sometimes allows us to not notice the fact that Orthodox Protestantism is also a large company, in a sense. So I would just follow the money, would be my simple answer. Okay, so you need a USP, you need a unique selling point or proposition. And people have this, what the hell's going on here, how did I get here sort of thing. You give them a compelling narrative. These people aren't reading the forums where you and I read these things being knocked down every day, and we know they're silly. They're not reading that stuff. There are people who perhaps can't afford a meal, are looking for some meaning in life, whatever it might be. Here's a really compelling story told by a charismatic preacher who happens to have a job. And this person's job is invested in telling the story convincingly. He reports, or she reports sometimes, of course usually he, reports to somebody higher up the food chain who wants more money because they've got a more important job. And so I think it's really, unfortunately, as simple as that. These memes are self-perpetuating to some extent, but I think it's really about money and power and politics.
Before I invite everybody to join us for a drink, I have one question. You talked about the fact that there are non-valuable or less valuable voices out there. One example is the creationist voice, and a lot of us know that John Lennox is coming to UCT in a couple of weeks. But also, we as a society, and I myself, consider freedom of speech one of the most important human values. How would you balance the importance of freedom of speech against these loud voices who are arguing from irreducible complexity, from the I is proven, the flagella is proven, all this sort of stuff? Balancing those two. How would you say that?
I'm not sure I see the conflict. I'm not sure I see the need for any balance. I mean, they can say what they like when they like. I mean, there's only a conflict when somebody's trying to impede your freedom of speech, which doesn't seem to be the case in the example you're citing. I mean, so I remember, Tarek, you were there like 4 or 5 years ago when we had Gareth, you were there too, we had somebody at a similar sort of gathering sitting in the front room praying before there was me also giving the talk that day. And that sort of thing is a very minor, it didn't bother me, but it's a very minor incursion on freedom of speech because it's meant to alienate and challenge and just take you out of your comfort zone or whatever. So in the case of that person's just being rude, so you want to say, just leave us alone, be a civilized human being, etc., etc. So that's one thing. Then you go from there to the spectrum of people chanting for your death or whatever it might be, and that's something which is obviously even more challenging. And there it takes a rare person to still want to have their say in the face of those sorts of threats. But what you're talking about is just dealing with the marketplace of ideas. They say their thing, and all that should do is inspire us to say something more clever and more loudly, and persuade people that they're wrong. It's not a free speech issue. I don't think. Let's take these last three, and then we have the one.
Well, perhaps actually in response to that question, and answer that you almost had with thing, where it's not a matter of stopping people from speaking so much as a matter of giving people the tools to be able to censor things for themselves.
Good.
So in that case, it's not about snuffing out that voice, just so much as letting people have the means to be able to tell that that voice is nonsense.
This is a bit of an odd question, but I'd be interested to know whether you think it's totally logically inconsistent or at all defensible. And it's something I've battled with and haven't really come down on one side of the argument or the other. I'm interested to know whether you think there's any room for the argument to self-identify, say, as a Jewish atheist or a Christian atheist, to acknowledge the cultural, traditional, or even familial benefits, advantages that come with religion, and at the same time to argue that those are transcendent of or not contingent upon a belief in God, the same way we might see that an Italian is often Catholic and a staunch nationalist, but they need not be, they can be separated, they can be divorced. So similarly, one might argue, say, that if I'm born Jewish, while I recognize the advantage of having a Friday night dinner with the family and the cultural and familial benefits that come with that, because Judaism is such an old religion, so is Christianity and Islam, there's a cultural phenomenon that's outgrown a belief in God per se. So, when people ask me, I like to say I'm a Jewish atheist, I pay my Jewish green fees, so to speak. So I go to shul, but I don't believe in God. But I'm not so sure that those two positions are necessarily logically inconsistent. I'd like to see what you think about that.
I think five of the 7 Jewish people I know closely are atheists. There's actually quite that's the least problematic religion as far as atheism is concerned, because I think it's a religion that's always encouraged a kind of critical reflection and philosophical attitude and whatever. So I think even if you were to call yourself straight out Jewish, nobody would expect you to be a theist. I don't think that would be the base assumption anyway. So you would be adding an extra signaling device on top of that to say you're a Jewish atheist. So my response to that would, look, I mean, it's been probably 25 years since I identified with any religion, so I would have to speculate, but I would go the statement route, to be honest. So pick up Chris Stedman's book from last year called Fatheist, and I would go that route of saying, let's create a new kind of consciousness around atheism that accepts that dimension of existence and life and community and all that sort of stuff, including Judaism and those rituals. I think that calling yourself a Jewish atheist is quite a confrontational route. And not so much in Judaism as would be in Anglicanism or whatever. Remember, Dawkins calls himself a cultural Anglican. So I mean, even the person that people mistakenly think of as the Rottweiler of atheism is happy to do what you say. So I think there is a precedent. My own personal choice would be to adopt a more generic label which indicates a non-hostility towards that enormously rich body of cultural tradition and heritage and whatever. Some get that?
So a question. You mentioned earlier that you consider yourself to be a humanist, amongst other things. And it was pointed out that freedom of speech is considered one of the sort of fundamentals of fundamental human rights. However, as you also pointed out, there are sort of limits to sort of what should be morally accessible as freedom of speech. In other words, you shouldn't really be able to sort of chant rather than death. What is your stance on limitations of freedom of speech?
Look, there's a difference between morally acceptable and legally permissible. So my answer would rest in separating those two things. I don't think that anything should be legally prohibited in terms of speech. Nothing at all. Even very harmful things, including hate speech. But I think that the weight of social condemnation should be so damn strong that people would have to, in a sense, be utterly insane to say certain things because of what the response would be, in a sense. So I would like to know who those people are. I don't want to keep them quiet, because then I might not know who they are. I'd like to know who they are up front and center, so I can say to everybody, that person there is an evil bastard. Don't sign deals with them, don't give them contracts, don't hire them, don't be their friend, etc.
Just quickly follow up on that. At the moment, the social majority seems to be of the religious type, and they sort of scream foul whenever anybody offends their religion. And sort of it should appear that that's not exactly ideal. So you're sort of saying that you want social pressure to ban certain types of speech, or at least make it morally inadmissible. But at the moment, that's dictated by religious societies.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so it's a matter of what the principles are that underpin the desire to suppress certain sorts of speech, which discourage, disincentivize certain forms of speech. So there they're doing it from a position of privilege to avoid difficult questions. If you were the racist or the sexist, it's not as if you say, look, I really have something important to say, you're just not listening to me. It's not that sort of conversation. We're shutting them down for different reasons, I think.
I just think we're shutting them down for their own reasons.
Yeah, okay, and we've got a political difference in how we interpret liberalism, don't we? I would imagine.
Okay, thank you.
All right, wine time then. Thank you.